Okay, good evening. Welcome to one and all. Wonderful as always to have the opportunity to do a little learning with you this evening. Last week we talked about Rav Reines and some of the foundations of the Mizrahi movement. And today I want to talk about one of, if not the most important personalities when we think about religious Zionism, and that is none other than Rav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. It's really an injustice to try to say anything about Rav Kook in 45 minutes, let alone a whole history of his life and his contribution to religious Zionism. But we'll scratch the surface. I hope that will whet people's appetites and encourage people to learn more about this truly extraordinary man. So let me try to provide a kind of thumbnail sketch of Rav Kook's biography, and then we'll spend some time looking at some of his writings, some of his texts, to understand what his relationship was with this thing we call religious Zionism. So by way of background, Rav Kook was born in present-day Latvia in 1865. He was the product of a mixed marriage, which is to say that his father was a misnagid and his mother was a kapuster chassid. Kapust is like an offshoot of Chabad, and it sort of prefigured, the kind of attempts at synthesis that would characterize a lot of his life, as we'll talk about, the notion of synthesizing opposing forces. He was a student in the yeshiva of Volozhin for a short time in 1884. He studied with Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the famed Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. And even though he was only there for a year and a half, the Netziv was quoted as saying that if Volozhin had been founded just to educate Rav Kook, that would have been enough. He understood right away who this young man was, and that he was destined for greatness. He also studied under a man called Rabbi Eliyahu David Rabinowitz Ta'omim, who was known as the Aderet, and the Aderet became the father-in-law of Rav Kook. In 1886, he married a woman named Batsheva, the daughter of the Aderet, and in 1887. At the age of 23, he took his first rabbinical position in the town of Zalmul, Lithuania, and then tragedy struck and his wife passed away at a very young age in 1888. During his period of mourning for his first wife, he basically took a sabbatical from his rabbinical position and wasn't active during that time. His father-in-law convinced him to remarry his cousin, who was the daughter of his father's brother. The Aderet was called Ta'omim because he had a twin brother. So his twin brother had a daughter, and Rav Kook ended up marrying the first cousin of his late wife. And he had three children with his second wife, two daughters and a son. His son became the kind of spiritual heir to his father's legacy. He became Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook. We could talk about him independently. 1895, Rav Kook became the rabbi of a slightly larger area or city called Bausk or Bauska. And in 1904, Rav Kook was invited to become the rabbi in Jaffa, which was, of course, then in Palestine under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Right? And Tel Aviv didn't exist yet. That's why we say, he was the chief rabbi of Jaffa. Right after he came, Theodor Herzl passed away. As you know, Theodor Herzl passed away in July of 1904. And Rav Kook, even though if you've seen the pictures, so you know that he's a very traditional man. Herzl was not a traditional man, and Rav Kook, in his official position, delivered a community-wide eulogy for the father of political Zionism, which, as you can imagine, was a big deal. And he actually said, by implication, that one way to conceive of Theodor Herzl was to think about him as the manifestation of the footsteps of Mashiach ben Yosef, like a precursor to a messianic era, someone who was paving the path to the national redemption. He wrote a number of important works during this time, and hopefully I'll have an opportunity to see some excerpts from some of them a little later on. Rav Kook in 1914 was on his way. 1916, I should say. World War I began 1916, right? So he was on his way to an Aguda conference in Europe, and he got stranded. World War I broke out unexpectedly, and he was stranded in Switzerland, in a town called St. Gallen. And I'll just share one excerpt from his time in St. Gallen, which I may have shared with you in the past. One of the people who would end up becoming one of his principal students was a man who was known as the Nazir of Yerushalayim. At the time, the Nazir of Yerushalayim was not a Nazir. He was a conflicted university student. As we talked a little bit about last time, the Haskalah is still very active, and young students who might be yeshiva students, might be university students, are struggling, and everyone is kind of making an attempt to sway them to their camp. A difficult time, and this young man, who became known as the Nazir of Yerushalayim, was deeply torn and deeply conflicted and deeply immersed in both Jewish philosophy and Western philosophy. He had heard about Rav Kook. He'd read something Rav Kook wrote. He wrote to Rav Kook. He said, "Can I meet you?" They ended up meeting, or making up to meet, in St. Gallen. And the Nazir wrote in his memoir. He said, we were staying in this inn, and Rav Kook was in the next room, and I woke up in the morning, and I heard his footsteps in the next room, and I heard him davening. I heard his say brachos and korbanos, and that was it. Just hearing Rav Kook daven like won me over. And this a man, it wasn't a Hasidish man who was like given to. He was a philosopher. But there was something about what Rav Soloveitchik once called the religious personality of this man, which was just magnetic and had this extraordinary impact on the people that he associated with. It wasn't even in the same room; it was just davening in the next room, and to hear the korbanos being uttered by Rav Kook had this transformative effect on the man who would become the Nazir. Eventually, Rav Kook made it to England, and Rav Kook shows up to your city, so you have to find some way to make the most of that opportunity. He became the rabbi of the Machzikei Tzedek congregation in London, and he stayed there until the end of the war. And we'll circle back to it, but it meant that he was in England during the granting of the Balfour Declaration. 1919, he returns to Palestine, and in 1921, he was appointed by the British, because now the situation has changed and Palestine is under the control of the British. In the post-World War I era, in 1921, he was appointed the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of mandatory Palestine. In 1924, he founds a yeshiva that becomes known as Merkaz Harav, which we'll talk about in a few moments. And he died in Jerusalem in 1935. You can look online. We have pictures of his funeral. They say 80,000 people came out and lined the streets of Yerushalayim. It was the largest funeral in modern history until that point in Jerusalem. They say a quarter of Jerusalem's population came out to honor Rav Kook when he passed away, Elul, 1935. Okay. Again, there's much more to say. That's just a thumbnail. So, what is Rav Kook's position when it comes to Zionism? What is his position when it comes to religious Zionism? And what is his contribution to the religious Zionist canon? So in his early years, Rav Kook actually had very little to do with Zionism or any of the proto-Zionist movements like Chibat Zion. And as one of his biographers writes, after the death of his wife, he really turned inward, and he was mainly focused on his family and his rabbinic career. Right, so he only gets to Palestine in 1904. Right, political Zionism really takes off with Herzl in 1896. But during these years in the 1880s and 1890s, Rav Kook is a Rav of small cities in Eastern Europe, and Zionism and political Zionism are not major priorities for him. Right? That being said, he has kind of a favorable reaction to the first Zionist Congress and the subsequent Zionist Congresses. And he makes in his early writings, some scattered references to Zionism. We would say that, in those early writings, 1901 to 1903, he's a qualified supporter of the idea of Jewish nationalism, which makes him in the minority. Again, remembering that traditional Jews were not, by and large, in favor of Zionism. As we talked a little bit about last week, everyone was contending with at least two major objections. Right? How can you follow a movement, the leader of which is totally not interested in Torah and mitzvos? And problem number two, how do you contend with the notion that's been operative or seemingly operative for 2,000 years, which is we don't rush the end, right? There's the three oaths at the Gemara and the end of Ksuvos. When Mashiach comes, we'll all go back to Zion, and until that time, we're not pushing our luck. Right? So that meant that most traditional Jews in Central and Eastern Europe were not just ambivalent about Zionism, but actually opposed to the whole idea. And this notion of religious Zionism was a minority, a tiny minority of the Jewish world. So when Mizrahi was founded, as we talked about last week in 1902, Rav Kook was ambivalent about it. Okay? They thought the answer to the question of the relationship between traditionalism and Zionism, they thought the answer was a separate religious Zionist party. But Rav Kook was not really interested in that. I'll just give you a kind of a snippet of a quote. He said in translation, "No parties, no special fractions of religious parties are we interested in. That's not the way to bring us to the goal that we long for. Our Torah and faith are our very life breath and the light of our lives. And so they must penetrate all the limbs of our people. You can't set up compartments. This is the religion department and this is the political department. No, it's all unified, and we're going to talk more about this. It's all integrated, and if you're going to do it, so just be part of it. Don't be a separate, you're the Zionist, but we're the religious. No, we're all in this together. If you're going to do it, that's how it should be. That's how it should be thought about. So I'll just share with you one excerpt in the source sheet. You can see in source number 1. This is a picture of Rav Kook with someone he met, obviously from the British government in 1921. But here's the source, and I just use it as a kind of example. Most of the excerpts I have for you are actually in translation. Rav Kook writes in this very poetic, very lyrical, difficult to penetrate kind of Hebrew. And you really have to be in it to understand all his allusions and his references to Tanakh and his references to Medrash. And he's a poet and a philosopher, and it makes his writing very deep and not that easy to understand, to say the least, to those who are uninitiated, myself included. V'hikaratam. Ki yesh mi shemechavev Eretz HaKodesh b'shvil sguloteh ha'ikaros. V'tzameh me'od lirtzot avanim ulchonen afara kedei l'kayam ha'mitzvot ha'tuliyot ba'aretz b'shvil ha'tachlit ha'elyona mitzat ba l'chlal Yisrael u'lchol ha'olam b'malatam ha'ruchaniyot. So he says, there's two separate kinds of people who long to get to see. The first is a kind of person who has a spiritual longing that wants to, touch the earth of the Holy Land, because to be in the Holy Land, that means that you get to have opportunities to do mitzvahs that are not able to be accomplished outside the land, and because there's some greater good that's achieved when the nation is in the land. Camp number one. ויש מי שמחדש בארץ הקודש וישתדל בישובה ודירתה בשביל שמכיר בתכלית של המנוחה החומרת לכלל ישראל. And there's another group that's not interested in spirituality and the holiness of the land. They're interested in the land because it's a place of refuge. And again, this is a moment in history where Jews are being oppressed and persecuted. It's very dangerous to try to live as a Jew, both spiritually and physically, in a lot of parts of Central and Eastern Europe, and Palestine, the land of Israel, is a place of refuge. Shugam kain davar tov v'niskav. Right, for that reason alone, it's a good place. So obviously those in the second camp are not as worthy as those in the first camp. It's just a matter of pragmatics as opposed to a matter of spirituality. But nonetheless, both are good. כי אצל הכלל יהפוך תמיד כל עניין גשמי לרוחני, והתכלית העליונה בה תבוא על ידי חיבור עם השם בארץ השם. But he says, if you have a national intention, if you have a national aspiration, then even those in the second camp, right, can do something transformative. Yahafoch tamid kol hanyan gashmi l'ruchani. You can transform the whole matter from an issue of pragmatics to an issue of spirituality. And again, this is going to be a big theme in the writings of Rav Kook, the idea that if you're thinking about something on a national level, right, for the entirety of the Jewish people, it takes on a whole different kind of significance and starts to have not just a pragmatic significance, but even a spiritual significance. And again, this is a big component of Rav Kook's philosophy, right? To see those, secular Zionists, they're not interested. They don't know anything about what it means to do a mitzvah in the land. They're not thinking about that at all. And yet, unknowingly, unconsciously, unwittingly, they're actually engaged in an extraordinarily spiritual project, even though they don't know. Okay. Before we look at the next source that I want to show you, let me just say a word of context. It's actually very important to understanding who Rav Kook was, the camps and the factions that he was dealing with, and the attempt at integration that he was trying to make. So, in the first half of the 20th century, when Rav Kook is living in Palestine, the Jewish population in Palestine is functionally divided into two groups, which we just call colloquially, and even in that moment were known this way, as the old Yeshuv and the new Yeshuv. And they are at polar opposite extremes in every imaginable way. So, and this is a little bit of a subtle point, but it's going to be important. The old Yeshuv is made up of, traditionalist Jews who had made Aliyah to the Holy Land for Jewish reasons, for halachic reasons, for spiritual reasons. And this group, right, their whole philosophy, their whole way of looking at the world was a philosophy that revolved around a conception that it had no responsibility for the country's physical or economic existence. In fact, it was just the opposite. They said, we're the korbanos, right? We're putting ourselves at great risk, in great peril. There's malaria, and there's a failing economy, and there's all kinds of dangers, and we're here because we believe that it's the right thing to be here, and as a kind of a means of reward. Maybe that's too strong a word, but we've earned the right to depend on everyone who's not here, right? We're holding down the fort, and so we're not going to try to work the. We're going to collect the chalukah. We're going to collect tzedakah from the Jews of the diaspora, okay? Because we're their representatives on the ground, right? You're a man in Washington. We're their people in Palestine. They're not risking life and limb to live. We're doing it. So you guys, you diaspora Jews, you support us. The new Yeshuv thought that whole mentality is crazy. You're going to depend on no, but we're self-sufficient, right? This is the secular Zionists. They come in the beginning of the 1880s and the 1890s, and they see this economic structure of the old Yeshuv, and they think it's ludicrous. You're going to depend on the diaspora. No, you need to put your chumash down, put your Gemara down, pick up a shovel, and start working the land so that we could make ends meet in a viable economic world. So you could understand, if you're in the old Yeshuv, you think the people in the new Yeshuv are out of their gourd. And if you're in the new Yeshuv, you think the people in the old Yeshuv are out of their gourd, right? The first principles, the starting place of these two camps are just like, right, on all levels, politically, religiously, economically, right? They're there and they're both in the land and they're there at the same time. They both love the land and they both care about and they each think that the other is, from another planet. And again, you could hear, once you hear this formulation, you hear the echoes of this tension, even in the 21st century. The heirs to this legacy, the people who say, "What do you mean we're not supporting the land? We're supporting the land by sitting and learning." Right? And then another camp says, "What do you mean we're not sitting in we picked up a rifle to defend the land. We're building the economy." Right? And sort of like a never the twain shall meet. 1924, Rav Kook founded a new yeshiva, which became known as Merkaz Harav, and became the flagship of the religious Zionist movement. And his idea, I'll just give you a quote. He said, the idea is to create a yeshiva to which the best students will stream from all over the world, outstanding in talent, inspiration, and idealism, to return the crown to its former glory, and to become expert in Torah of the land and in the revival of sanctity in the Holy Land. Okay, and I'll just share with you a picture, right? So this doesn't look like Volozhin, right? This doesn't look like Panovich. This doesn't look like Telz. There's a sense that there's going to be some kind of integration, and I have for you. I'm sorry I didn't put the source where this came from, but I saw it and adapted it a little. But it's actually a nice summary of the goals of the yeshiva. A, it's appropriate that parallel to the material development experienced by the population of Eretz Yisrael, a spiritual renewal also take place that will influence the image of the new Yeshuv now being fashioned. So the idea is we're going to work together. It's not that we're in two separate worlds, it's one world, and there could be some influence of Torah on the people who are building up the land. B, the spiritual leadership of the new Yeshuv will blossom within the walls of the yeshiva. Right? The goal is integration. C, the students of the yeshiva will occupy themselves, among other things, with the search for solutions to contemporary halachic problems, will consolidate a body of scholars, men of action, cultured and well-mannered in Eretz Yisrael. You can't be oblivious to the issues of the time, right? And famously, right, you have issues like Shemitah. So it's very nice if you're learning in Eastern Europe in the 1890s and you want to know what the halachos of Shemitah are. Okay, so you could philosophize until you're blue in the face about the halachos of Shemitah. But now it's 1909 or whatever the year is, and if you stop working the land, you're not going to have food to feed your kids. So should we keep Shemitah or should we find a workaround? right, there's going to have to be some meeting of the minds where, right, the halachic and the pragmatic can come together. D, the yeshiva will produce the nation with all that it lacks spiritually, including literature and poetry, so that people with literary gifts will not be restricted to the circles of those who have rebelled against Judaism. Well, amazing to think that the yeshiva wasn't just going to be like in addition to, right, but that's actually a goal of the yeshiva, is to produce a literary canon which will be appealing to people outside the yeshiva. And E, the yeshiva will emphasize the spirit of nationalism, and this will prove that even Orthodox yeshiva students of Eretz Yisrael do not lack nationalistic feelings. And you can just see Rav Kook, right, saying like, no, we don't want them to be against us. We want them to be with us, right? And if they recognize that we share their sense of nationalism as an aspiration, right, that will make it all the more likely that we can join together in common purpose. You can look in source number 3, and again, I'll put the source sheet. It's on the website, or I put it up in the chat if you want to pull it up. But in the interest of time, I'll just mention a highlight or two from source number 3, which is Rav Kook's famous introduction to his book Orot, where he writes in English. He says, "The land of Israel is not an external thing, an external national acquisition, a means to the goal of general unity and strengthening of the physical or even spiritual. The land of Israel is an intrinsic section of the nation, attached to it with a living bond entwined with its existence in internal uniqueness." And, as I say, a lot of his writing is really impenetrable. Even if you could translate it, right, you understand that he's saying something quite significant and quite lofty and quite important, and you can grasp around the edges of what it is, but you can't always penetrate to the depths of what Rav Kook is saying. It's a good introduction to just say at this point that if you're interested in Rav Kook, I strongly recommend all the works of Rabbi Dr. Yehuda Mirsky. Okay, he wrote a biography of Rav Kook called Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revelation and Time of Revolution. It's the Yale Jewish Live series, an extraordinary biography. He has a new book, which is based on his dissertation about the early writings of Rav Kook. Just came out in the last year or two. Number of articles and podcasts online. Anything he does is gold, and it's the best way to access and understand Rav Kook, Yehuda Mirsky. So I'll just share with you one quote from Professor Mirsky in source number 4, so you can get a flavor of his writing, and it's amazing because he preserves the lyricism and the deep philosophy of Rav Kook even in translation. He says, interestingly, this is Yehuda Mirsky talking. Interestingly, in his many writings predating his Aliyah in 1904, the land of Israel scarcely figures, certainly not as a category of theological analysis and lens through which to view other concepts and contemporary movements. This in contrast to the Jewish people who so figured for him from the beginning. This changed with his migration. Not only did halachic questions arising from settling the land begin to take up his attention, most famously in his controversial support for the sale of the land to non-Jews during the Shemitah year, in order to preserve and support the burgeoning enterprise of agricultural settlement, but in his theology as well. This meant not simply reckoning with the theological import of the land, but weaving it into his emergent vision of secular Zionism's paradoxical role in long-awaited redemption, not only of the Jewish people, but of Judaism itself and the natural world. In his densely elusive network of ideas, Israel's exile from the land was part of the alienation of the eternal, unchanging written law from the vibrant, responsive oral law. These alienations of people, land, and Torah all in turn reflect the divine presence's fundamental homelessness in the world, to be cured in Rav Kook's audacious dialectical vision by none other than the revolutionary dislocations of secular modernity. So what Professor Mirsky is describing is this sense that Rav Kook understood Rav Kook believed that the secular Zionists were actually on some level responsible for a movement toward national redemption, right? In a religious way, in a spiritual way. Right. And it's I sort of can't overstate it, but it's an extraordinary inversion, which is to say that the traditionalists always looked so unfavorably upon the secularists. Like, you're not doing what the Torah says, and you're not doing what Hashem says you should be doing. And Rav Kook inverted the whole thing. They're like, no, they don't even, right? Just because they're not conscious of it doesn't mean they're not pushing forward the project of national redemption. They might talk about it in political terms. They might talk about it in economic terms. They might say they're socialists. But on a larger level, on the grand scale of Jewish history and Jewish destiny, something else is happening here. And you could look at that group of people and call them secular Zionists all you want. What they're actually doing is something godly. And it's an extraordinary way to see the world and to see other human beings in the world who are so unlike and so unalike the world that he was coming from. So it's quite subtle, and it's quite revolutionary. And so you can imagine that it met with all kinds of opposition. And it's a subject for another time, but in Rav Kook's 20 some odd years from 1904 until 1935, he was hated and derided and scolded and made fun of by everyone right, left, and center. Everyone knew this was a man of towering genius, and everyone knew this was someone with extraordinary capabilities intellectually and religiously and halachically, but he was so difficult to understand. What he was saying was so revolutionary that it was so difficult for people to assimilate his words that he met with all kinds of opposition, and he never caved. Whatever they said about him, he never said it about them. So before we run out of time, let me share maybe just one or two more sources that will help, I hope, give a little flavor for Rav Kook's vision of the role of the non-religious in the Zionist project and the role of Zionism in the Messianic project. Okay, so I have for you in source number 5 an essay by Isidore Epstein in a book of biographical essays, which was actually edited by Rabbi Young. I should have mentioned Rabbi Young met Rav Kook when Rabbi Young was in England in the 19-teens during World War I. His father was very active in the British rabbinic establishment. And Rabbi Young actually learned as a student with Rav Kook during those years and obtained smicha from Rav Kook. He had 3 smichas. One of them was from Avraham, Yitzchak, HaKohen. So in this essay by Isidore Epstein, I'll just share with you a brief excerpt. This is source number 5 on your sheets. Isidore Epstein writes the following. He says, the prevalent irreligion among young chalutzim in particular was not to be compared with the infidelities of the past. The young today are singularly, he's writing in the mind and philosophy of Rav Kook. The young today are singularly free from all superstitious and idolatrous cults, which are the real enemies of godliness and spirituality. Theirs is but a loss of sensitiveness to things divine through a lack of understanding and perception. Outwardly, evil. Inwardly, they are good, holy, the true representatives of the pre-messianic generation, which according to the Zohar was to be good within and evil without. Right? So the untrained eye, right there in Machal Shabbos before Hesia, they look like they're not doing the right thing according to everything we know about Torah and mitzvos. But really, what's happening inside is totally different. Moreover, he went so far as to blame the religious elements for the attitude of the non-religious youth. And this is amazing. He says their estrangement from Judaism, the socialists, secular Zionists, why don't they care about Torah mitzvahs? He says is motivated in most cases by ideals of social justice, which they are led to imagine find no response in our midst. In view of our failure, the religious establishment's failure, of our failure to participate actively in the affairs of the world. They look at us and they see us sitting in the base medrash and they think we're totally out of touch, which they do not appreciate the limitations imposed upon us by the absence of the necessary geographical political factors of which we've been deprived by our loss of country and kingdom. But we're only sitting in the base medrash and we're not active in building up society because we're in exile. But now that we're back in our own land, you bet your life we're going to be involved in building up the economy and the society and the land because it's our land. Of course, that's what we'll do. But this very quest for social righteousness is in itself the way of the Lord. He says these people who just want to do the social thing, that is part of our Masorah, which Abraham, our father, had commanded his children and his household, that they may do righteousness and justice, right? They're not sitting there with the Shulchan Aruch, but what they're doing is positive. All the errors of the young generation thus consist merely in that they do not realize that in order to attain the good goals they are desiring, the children of Israel must honor the Torah and cleave to the faith, which is the light of the whole world and its life. There's something they don't know, and we want to educate them, we want to teach them, and that is that they're going to achieve their goal better if they can integrate Torah mitzvahs into their lives. There was thus every reason to hope that with clear insight and enlightenment, they would be touched by the spirit of godliness and realize in them and through their own lives the divine qualities inherent in God's chosen people. So I'll just circle back for 1 second, since we were in England in World War I. The Balfour Declaration was a huge deal for Rav Kook. Right? Once the Balfour Declaration happened, right? He had this sense that this wasn't just like a slow movement back to a redemptive process, but like the world is changing. And these are really the footsteps of the Messianic era. He said, this is Professor Mirsky again, in his biography. He says, throughout Jewish history, he wrote, Zion has signified political sovereignty, indispensable and sacred in its own way, while Jerusalem has signified the sacred in and of itself, the highest goal of Israel and humanity. Our goal, he wrote, is for Jerusalem to walk peacefully with Zion under, started a new movement, which this one didn't really take off, Degel Yerushalayim. There's no doubt that God's power is being revealed through world events. Having seen Balfour, the Jewish message of redemption must emerge from hiding and become the active force in Jewish national life and on the world stage. Jews must convey to the whole world that the recent wondrous world events, so obviously targeted at their redemption, will usher in the redemption of the human race. Okay, and it's hard for us to think about this. World War I was so overshadowed by World War II and the Holocaust. But in the interwar period, and again, no one knew it was an interwar period, just post-World War I, it was a calamity of unspeakable proportions. The number of dead and the number of maimed and the number of dislocated, and I mean, there was no one who wasn't touched by this calamity. And it was not uncommon to see this kind of calamity as part of an upheaval which must be leading to something redemptive. Add to World War I, the Balfour Declaration and immigration to Palestine, and Rav Kook interpreted it as a recipe for a roadmap to, forgive the mixed metaphor, a roadmap to the ultimate redemption. We have to wrap up in a minute, so I just want to conclude with a story and a brief summary. The story I want to share is you can actually find it online. If you just Google the words Rav Soloveitchik on Rav Kook. Okay, it's a 6-minute clip. And it's a little hard to understand. It has Hebrew subtitles, I think. Rav Soloveitchik on Rav Kook. If you can't find it, just email me. I'll send it to you. And Rav Soloveitchik tells the following story. He said in his speech in 1969. Rav Soloveitchik had been to Palestine in 1935, and he had actually visited Rav Kook. It was the summer of 1935. It was just a couple months before Rav Kook had passed away. He was already on his sick bed when Rav Soloveitchik went to see him. The story he tells is not a first-hand story; it's a second-hand story. In 1935, Rav Soloveitchik visited a little yeshuv called Kinneret, still around. And as he describes it, Kinneret was this totally, socialist, communist, anti-religious kibbutz. And he gets there, and he says to himself, obviously, I can't eat. There's nothing to eat. You go to a non-kosher affair, you say, I'll order the fruit plate. Or Soloveitchik says, I can't even order the fruit plate. In Israel, so the fruits, it's like nobody took Truma and Meiser. You can't eat the fruit either. He says, I'm not going to eat. So they get there. He gets there, and they offer him some food. And he says, "Thank you. I politely decline. I'm not going to eat." And they explain to him. They say, "No, you can have the grapes. It's totally fine. We have a rabbi from the Rabbanut, and he comes every so often, and he takes Truma and Meiser, and we promise you, it's all kosher v'yasher." And Soloveitchik is taken aback. It's like, what is this communist kibbutz doing with a rabbi who comes and takes Truma and Meiser? That's amazing. And then they say to him, it's not just that they take Truma and Meiser. Our whole kitchen is kosher. All the plates, everything is kosher. And Soloveitchik is like, a communist yeshuv, what? How do you have a kosher kitchen? Why do you have a kosher kitchen? And they say, we'll tell you the story. Rav Kook once came for Shabbos. This was the thing. Rav Kook, at various points, went on these tshuva tours, where he tried to just bring people around and teach Torah, and the new yeshuv, they didn't know anything about Torah mitzvahs. Educate them a little, give a little feeling of what it means to have Torah mitzvahs. They never heard of it. So he said, Rav Kook once came to our yeshuv for Shabbos. And he knew he couldn't eat anything, so he brought with him his pekalach of wine and 2 challahs. Friday night he came to the Chader Ochel, and we're all turning the lights on and off, and it's just a regular weeknight for us. And he makes kiddush, and he says hamotzi, doesn't eat anything, and he benches and he leaves. Shabbos morning, he comes to us, he says, any chance we could have a minyan? And we laugh. We're like, a minyan? Shminyan? What are you talking about? We don't do that here. And they're getting out in the fields, and they're picking the oranges, and it's a regular day. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, doesn't matter. We never heard of Shabbos. Rav Kook davens. This is what the kibbutznikim are telling Rav Soloveitchik. And Rav Kook davens, and he pulls out his wine, and he makes kiddush, and he says hamotzi in the Chader Ochel, with everyone just doing what they're doing. Shabbos comes, Shabbos goes. After Shabbos, he comes to the Chader Ochel, and everyone's having their regular Saturday night activity. And he makes Havdalah, and he says, maybe I could tell you a story, a little bit about my parents, who I am, where I'm from. And they listen, and they say goodnight. And Sunday morning, Rav Kook, davens by himself, and he says, thank you so much. And he says goodbye. And then Rav Soloveitchik says, the kibbutznikim told me that after that Shabbos, they threw away all their treif dishes, and they kashered their kitchen. And Rav Soloveitchik says this was the effect of what he calls the religious personality. He didn't say anything. He didn't teach a shiur. He didn't do anything. He just spent Shabbos with them. And you spend Shabbos with Rav Kook, and it's like a life-altering. And saying he heard it from the kibbutznikim themselves. They showed him the kosher plates. And that is the kind of magic and mystery of this extraordinary man who could move people and who could move nations, right, just by virtue of the force of his persona. I'll just give a quick summary, a quick synopsis of the salient points of Rav Kook and Zionism, and there's obviously so much more to say. 5 quick points. Number 1, there are historical precedents for significant Jewish movements in which irreligious Jews played a major role So stop hawking my Chinik. Herzl's not religious and the secular. It's okay. Number two, the special merits of Eretz Yisrael will elevate those who participate in its settlement and rebuilding. You're so nervous. All these people, the majority of them are secular and they don't know anything. The secular today, give it a little time, they're going to become more spiritual just by virtue of the fact that they're building up the land of Israel. Number three, the original roots of Zionism are holy, going back to the disciples of the Vilna Gaon, as we talked about last week. And Zionism must be returned to these authentic holy roots. So you can't just say, let them do what they're doing. No, there's a process which actually began before the secular Zionists to which we can return. Point number four, the successes of secular Zionism are due to their concern for the notion of Jewish nationhood. And it's a necessary correction to the imbalance caused by centuries of statelessness. And the idea of Zionism is going to bring us back to a kind of center where we rightly belong. And number five, Rav Kook over time came to see a messianic component of Zionism, which was amplified posthumously by his son and by his students. Ikvasa de Mashiach, these are the footsteps of the messianic era. Rav Kook was singular. Rav Kook was one of a kind. It's the work of a lifetime to penetrate the depths of his lyricism and his mystical personality. All we've done here is open up the door a crack just to catch a glimpse of the light that continues to radiate from a tzaddik Yesod Olam. With apologies, I have to stop here and run to Mincha, but happy to continue the conversation and always happy to continue learning the extraordinary work of Avraham, Yitzchak, HaKohen Kook. Thank you, everyone. Please, God, we'll pick up next time.